"Do you even speak English, old man?" The voice sliced through the sterile hospital corridor like a scalpel through flesh, sharp with the kind of medical arrogance that only comes from a few years of residency and a God complex that could fill an operating room. But what Dr. Mitchell couldn't see as he stood over the elderly janitor mopping the floor was the steady hands that had once held a dying soldier's heart together in a makeshift field hospital in Kandahar, when morphine was a luxury and miracles were the only medicine that mattered. Samuel Doc Rodriguez, 73 years old and carrying the weight of 1,000 battlefield prayers in his stooped shoulders, continued his methodical cleaning of the trauma bay. The rhythmic swish of the mop across linoleum was his only response. He had learned decades ago that sometimes the most powerful medicine was silence, especially when dealing with wounded egos that couldn't be sutured. The morning shift at Chicago General Hospital was in full swing, the kind of organized chaos that defined urban trauma care. Samuel had been working the night cleaning crew for 3 years now, invisible to most of the medical staff who rushed past him in their pristine scrubs and polished stethoscopes. He preferred it that way. Invisibility was a skill he'd perfected in war zones, where being seen could mean death, and old habits died hard. Dr. Mitchell was young, probably 32, Samuel guessed from the confident way he carried himself. Fresh out of his surgery residency, board-certified in trauma surgery, and absolutely certain that his medical degree made him the smartest person in any room. He represented everything modern medicine prided itself on: cutting-edge technology, evidence-based protocols, and the unshakable belief that newer was always better. He also represented everything that was slowly dying in healthcare, the understanding that healing was as much art as science, that experience could trump textbook knowledge, and that sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. "I said move your cart," Mitchell pressed, his voice echoing off the hospital walls. "We've got incoming trauma cases. This bay needs to be sterile, not cluttered with your cleaning supplies." Samuel paused his mopping and looked up at the young doctor. His eyes, the color of coffee that had seen too many long nights, held a depth that made Mitchell unconsciously step back. There was no defiance in that gaze, no anger, just the quiet assessment of a man who had seen things that couldn't be learned in medical school. The trauma bay where they stood was a testament to modern medical technology. Monitors lined the walls, their screens ready to display vital signs in real time. Surgical instruments gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, each tool precisely calibrated and sterilized. It was a far cry from the mud-floored tents where Samuel had once practiced medicine, where creativity and determination mattered more than protocols and procedures. "The floor needs cleaning," Samuel said finally, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language but had spoken it for 50 years. "Blood from the last case creates infection risk." The practical response seemed to irritate Mitchell more than silence would have. It was so mundane, so divorced from the high-stakes drama of trauma surgery that he lived for. "That's what environmental services is for later," Mitchell snapped. "Right now I need this space clear for actual medical work. You understand? Medical work. Life and death." Other medical staff had begun to notice the confrontation. A few nurses paused their preparations to watch, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to sympathetic. They knew Samuel as a quiet, reliable presence, who never complained and always went the extra mile to keep their work areas clean and organized. Dr. Mitchell, on the other hand, was developing a reputation for arrogance that made even the most experienced nurses roll their eyes. Samuel bent down to move his cleaning cart, his movements careful and measured. As he did, the collar of his janitor's uniform shifted, revealing a small section of his neck and upper chest. For just a moment, the edge of an old tattoo became visible, faded blue ink that looked like it might once have been a medical caduceus, though the design was too worn to make out clearly. Mitchell didn't notice. He was too focused on asserting his authority over what he saw as hospital support staff. But someone else did see it, and her sharp intake of breath was audible, even over the ambient noise of the trauma unit. Nurse Patricia Coleman had been working trauma for 25 years, long enough to see doctors come and go, long enough to learn that the real heroes of healthcare often wore the humblest uniforms. She'd been watching the confrontation with growing discomfort, but that glimpse of faded ink on Samuel's neck triggered a memory that made her heart race. She had seen that style of tattoo before, in old military medical texts and veteran publications. It wasn't just any caduceus, it was the specific design used by Army combat medics who had served in forward operating bases, the men and women who had earned their medical knowledge not in lecture halls but in the field, under fire, with lives literally hanging in the balance. Patricia felt a chill run down her spine as pieces began to click into place. Samuel's careful attention to hygiene protocols that went beyond hospital requirements, the way he handled medical waste with the precision of someone trained in field sanitation, his uncanny ability to anticipate what medical teams needed before they asked for it. The quiet competence that she had attributed to good work ethic might be something much more significant. "Dr. Mitchell," Patricia said, her voice cutting through his continued berating of Samuel. "Perhaps we could—" "Not now, Coleman," Mitchell interrupted without looking at her. "I'm dealing with a situation here." He turned back to Samuel, who had moved his cart, but was now methodically checking the trauma bay's equipment, not cleaning it, but inspecting it with the eye of someone who understood exactly what each piece was for. "What do you think you're doing now?" Mitchell demanded. "Those instruments aren't toys. You can't just—" "Intubation kit is missing the 7.0 ET tube," Samuel said quietly, pointing to an open medical kit. "Adult male trauma, you'll want that size. Current kit only has 6.5 and 8.0. Mitchell stared at him, momentarily thrown off balance. He looked at the intubation kit, and sure enough, there was a gap where the 7.0 endotracheal tube should have been. "How did you—" But Patricia Coleman was already moving, her phone out, scrolling through her contacts with hands that trembled slightly. She had to make a call, had to confirm what she was beginning to suspect. If she was right, then Dr. Mitchell wasn't just being rude to a janitor. He was humiliating a man whose medical knowledge and experience might exceed that of half the doctors in the hospital. She stepped away from the confrontation, finding a quiet corner where she could make her call without being overheard. The number she dialed was for Dr. James Harrison, the hospital's chief of staff, and a man who had served as an army surgeon in Iraq before transitioning to civilian medicine. "Dr. Harrison's office," came the crisp voice of his secretary. "This is Patricia Coleman from Trauma. I need to speak with Dr. Harrison immediately. It's about a potential situation involving a veteran." There was a pause. "He's in surgery, Nurse Coleman. Can I take a message?" Patricia looked back toward the trauma bay, where Mitchell was still lecturing Samuel about staying in his lane. "Tell him we may have a combat medic working in our facility. Tell him the name is Samuel Rodriguez, and I think he might be someone we need to know about." The pause that followed was longer this time. "I'll get him the message immediately," the secretary said, her tone suddenly urgent. Back in the trauma bay, the confrontation was escalating. Mitchell had found his rhythm now, playing to an audience of medical staff who were too busy to intervene but clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. "Look, I get it," Mitchell said, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. "You're trying to be helpful, but this is a hospital, not a— wherever you come from. We have protocols here, standards. Everything has to be done by qualified medical personnel." Samuel simply nodded, accepting the criticism with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. But those who knew how to look could see the subtle signs of a man who was choosing his battles carefully, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had unconsciously moved to a position that would allow him to respond quickly if needed. "Maybe it's time to consider retirement," Mitchell continued, warming to his theme. "Let younger, more qualified people handle the important work. You could find something more suitable, maybe a mall security job or something that doesn't require—" He was interrupted by the sudden wail of sirens approaching the hospital. The distinctive sound of multiple ambulances, the kind of convoy that meant mass casualties, were incoming. The trauma team immediately shifted into high gear, their personal drama forgotten as professional instincts took over. "Multiple GSWs incoming," shouted a paramedic through the radio. "ETA 2 minutes, we've got 3 critical, 2 urgent, and 1 walking wounded from a gang shooting." The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses began setting up additional equipment, residents rushed to scrub in, and Mitchell suddenly found himself in charge of coordinating care for more critical patients than he'd ever handled simultaneously. Samuel quietly moved his cart to the corner and began what appeared to be routine cleaning, but Patricia Coleman, watching him carefully now, noticed that his movements had changed. Gone was the slow, methodical pace of a janitor going through the motions. Instead, he moved with the fluid efficiency of someone preparing for battle, checking sightlines, ensuring pathways were clear, positioning himself where he could observe everything while staying out of the way. The first ambulance screeched to a halt outside the trauma doors. Paramedics burst through with a young man whose chest was covered in blood, his breathing shallow and rapid. 22-year-old male, 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, possible pneumothorax, BP dropping fast, the lead paramedic shouted as they transferred the patient to the trauma table. Mitchell stepped forward, his training taking over despite his relative inexperience with cases this severe. He began his assessment, calling out orders to the nursing staff, but Patricia could see the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his nervousness. The second ambulance arrived before he could get the first patient stabilized. this one carrying a teenage girl with abdominal wounds and a middle-aged man who was conscious but losing blood rapidly from a leg wound. I need 2 more trauma teams, Mitchell called out, but the harsh reality of urban hospital staffing hit immediately. They were already running with minimal coverage, and the additional doctors he needed were either in surgery or not immediately available. Dr. Harrison is in the OR for another hour, Patricia reported after checking with the charge nurse. Dr. Williams is handling a cardiac emergency in the ICU. We're on our own. For the first time since the confrontation began, doubt flickered across Mitchell's face. 3 critical patients, each requiring immediate surgical intervention, and he was the only trauma surgeon available. His textbook knowledge was comprehensive, his technical skills were solid, but he'd never faced a situation like this without senior supervision. The first patient's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His oxygen saturation was dropping despite supplemental oxygen, and Mitchell could see the telltale signs of tension pneumothorax, a condition that required immediate intervention to prevent death. I need a chest tube set up, Mitchell called out, his voice tight with stress. And someone get me a 14-gauge needle, 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line, came a quiet voice from the corner of the room. Mitchell turned to see Samuel standing beside his cleaning cart, no longer pretending to mop the floor. The old man's eyes were fixed on the patient, and his expression had completely changed from the submissive janitor of moments before to something else entirely, the focused intensity of a medical professional assessing a life-threatening situation. What did you say? Mitchell demanded, but he was already moving toward the supply cabinet, his hands automatically reaching for the equipment Samuel had mentioned. Tension pneumothorax, Samuel repeated, his voice calm and authoritative. You can see the tracheal deviation, the distended neck veins. He needs immediate decompression before you can place the chest tube, or he'll arrest. Mitchell stared at him for a moment, his mind racing. The assessment was exactly correct. He could see the signs Samuel had mentioned, signs he had been too stressed to notice clearly. But how could a janitor? The patient's monitor began alarming urgently, jolting Mitchell back to action. There wasn't time to question how Samuel knew what he knew. There was only time to act. Nurse Coleman, prep for needle decompression, Mitchell called out, grabbing the 14-gauge needle Samuel had specified. His hands were steadier now, his movements more confident with the clear assessment guiding his actions. He positioned the needle and inserted it quickly and precisely. There was an immediate hiss of escaping air, and the patient's oxygen saturation began to improve almost instantly. Good, Samuel said quietly, and somehow that simple word carried more weight than a dozen congratulations from senior physicians. Now the chest tube, then move to the abdominal case. She's bleeding internally, probably splenic laceration. Mitchell looked over at the teenage girl on the second table, where nurses were working to establish IV access and get vital signs. He couldn't see the signs Samuel was referring to, but something in the old man's tone convinced him to trust the assessment. How do you? Mitchell began, but Samuel was already moving, not toward the patient, but toward a supply cabinet that he opened with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where everything was located. He began pulling out equipment, sutures, hemostats, surgical instruments that no janitor should have known how to identify, much less locate. Samuel, Patricia Coleman said, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the trauma bay stop and look at her. Samuel Rodriguez, you're not just a janitor, are you? For a moment the controlled chaos of the trauma bay seemed to pause. Samuel looked at Patricia, and she could see the decades of carefully maintained anonymity warring with the immediate medical need in front of them. Not today, he said finally, his accent more pronounced now as emotion crept into his voice. Today, I'm whatever these kids need me to be. He moved to the third patient, the man with the leg wound who was conscious but pale from blood loss. Without asking permission, Samuel began cutting away the patient's clothing to expose the wound, his movements professional and efficient. Femoral artery, he announced. Partial laceration, not complete, but he's losing volume fast. Direct pressure first, then surgical repair. Mitchell found himself following Samuel's guidance without question, his medical training recognizing the voice of genuine expertise even if he couldn't understand its source. The old man's knowledge wasn't theoretical, it was practical, immediate, and absolutely correct. Dr. Mitchell, Patricia called out urgently. Dr. Harrison is on his way down. He's bringing some files with him, but Mitchell was too focused on the medical crisis to pay attention to administrative concerns. Under Samuel's quiet guidance, he had successfully stabilized the first patient and was now working on the abdominal surgery that would save the teenage girl's life. The man with the leg wound was stable, his bleeding controlled by Samuel's expert field dressing. It wasn't until the immediate crisis had passed, until all 3 patients were stable and being prepared for transport to the OR, that Mitchell finally had a moment to process what had just happened. He turned to Samuel, who was quietly returning unused medical supplies to their proper locations, with the casual familiarity of someone who had done this countless times before. "Who are you?" Mitchell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Samuel could answer, the trauma bay doors burst open again, but this time, It wasn't paramedics, it was Dr. James Harrison, the chief of staff, moving with an urgency that had nothing to do with medical emergencies and everything to do with the manila folder clutched in his hands. Dr. Harrison closed the folder and looked directly at Mitchell, his expression stern.
Dr. Mitchell, you have just witnessed one of the most experienced combat medics in the history of the U.S. Army save 3 lives using knowledge and skills that he earned in the deadliest places on Earth, and you told him he should consider mall security.
The rebuke was devastating in its quiet delivery. Mitchell wanted to disappear, to find some way to undo the last hour of his life. But Samuel stepped forward, raising a weathered hand that bore the small scars of 1,000 medical procedures performed under impossible conditions.
Dr. Harrison,
Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm. The young doctor did his job. He saved those patients. I just reminded him of a few things he already knew. He looked at Mitchell, and there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for revenge or humiliation. Medicine is not about ego, mijo, Samuel said, using the Spanish endearment that somehow didn't sound condescending coming from him. It's about serving those who need help. Today you served. That's all that matters. Mitchell felt tears forming in his eyes, though he fought to maintain his professional composure. The grace in Samuel's response was more humbling than any punishment could have been. Sir, Mitchell said, his voice cracking slightly, I owe you an apology. What I said, how I treated you, there's no excuse. Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Apology accepted, doctor. But more important than apologies is what we do next. Those patients need follow-up care, and there are others who will need our help. He gestured toward the trauma bay, where the evidence of their successful collaboration was evident in the clean, organized space ready for the next emergency. Maybe, Samuel said quietly, we can work together. I have some experience that might be useful, and you have energy and knowledge that can make a difference. What do you say? Dr. Harrison watched the exchange with growing amazement. This was leadership in its purest form, not the assertion of authority through rank or credentials, but the quiet offer of partnership and shared purpose. Mr. Rodriguez, Dr. Harrison said formally, I would like to offer you a position on our medical staff. We have openings for experienced physician's assistants in our trauma department, and based on what I've witnessed today, Samuel held up his hand politely. Thank you, Dr. Harrison, but I'm happy with my current job. The cleaning crew needs good people too, and I've found that you can serve patients in many different ways. He paused, looking around at the medical staff who were still processing what they had learned. But if you'd like, I could make myself available as a consultant, teaching some of the field medicine techniques that might be useful here. Combat medicine has some applications in civilian trauma care. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward eagerly. I would be honored to learn from you, sir, he said, and the respect in his voice was genuine and complete. If you'd be willing to teach me. Samuel nodded approvingly. We teach each other, doctor. That's how medicine works best. Over the following weeks, an unusual partnership developed at Chicago General Hospital. Dr. Mitchell, humbled by his encounter with Samuel, became one of the most dedicated students of combat medicine principles that anyone on staff had ever seen. He would seek Samuel out during quiet moments, asking questions about field triage, emergency procedures under resource constraints, and the psychological aspects of treating trauma patients. Samuel, while maintaining his position on the cleaning crew, began conducting informal training sessions for the medical staff. His lessons weren't theoretical. They were practical applications of medical knowledge gained under the most extreme conditions imaginable. In the field, Samuel would explain to a group of residents gathered around a practice mannequin, you don't have the luxury of perfect conditions. You work with what you have, where you are, with the knowledge you possess. The key is not to let perfect be the enemy of good. He taught them improvisation techniques that weren't in any textbook, how to create surgical instruments from common materials, how to perform life-saving procedures with minimal equipment, how to make critical decisions when laboratory results and imaging weren't available. But more importantly, he taught them about the human side of emergency medicine. Every patient is someone's son, someone's daughter, he would say during these sessions. In combat, we had a saying, no one fights alone. The same is true in medicine. Every patient who comes through those doors is part of a family, a community. Our job isn't just to treat their injuries, it's to preserve their place in the world. Dr. Mitchell absorbed these lessons with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered that his education, comprehensive as it was, had only been the beginning of what he needed to know. The transformation in Mitchell was remarkable. His colleagues noticed that his bedside manner had improved dramatically, that he seemed to possess a new confidence in emergency situations, and that he had developed an almost intuitive sense for what patients and families needed beyond medical treatment. "It's like he's been taking lessons from someone," Nurse Coleman observed to a colleague. "He's become the kind of doctor we all hoped he could be." But the real test came 6 months after Samuel's identity had been revealed, when Chicago General faced its largest mass casualty event in decades. A chemical plant explosion on the city's south side resulted in dozens of casualties, ranging from severe burns to respiratory injuries to trauma from flying debris. The hospital's emergency department was overwhelmed within minutes, with patients arriving faster than they could be processed. Dr. Mitchell found himself once again in charge of coordinating care for more patients than the available resources could handle. But this time, he wasn't alone. Samuel, officially still a janitor, but recognized by every member of the medical staff as a critical resource, quietly assumed a coordination role that no organizational chart could have defined. "Triage the burns first," he advised Mitchell, his voice calm amid the chaos. "Chemical burns progress differently than thermal burns. We need to get them decontaminated and treated before the damage becomes irreversible." He moved through the emergency department like a battlefield medic, assessing patients with a glance, directing resources where they were most needed, and providing the kind of steady, experienced presence that kept the medical team functioning under extreme stress. "Respiratory cases to room 3. We'll need CPAP setups and bronchial lavage equipment," he called out to the nursing staff, who followed his directions without question. "Trauma patients to the main bay. We can handle 3 simultaneous procedures if we set up the equipment correctly." Under Samuel's guidance and Mitchell's leadership, Chicago General processed more critical casualties in a single shift than any hospital in the city's history, with a survival rate that exceeded national standards for mass casualty events. The success wasn't just medical, it was organizational, demonstrating how experience and humility could work together to achieve results that neither could accomplish alone. Later, as the last patients were being stabilized and transferred to appropriate units, Dr. Harrison found Samuel in his usual spot, quietly cleaning the trauma bay and preparing it for the next emergency. "Samuel," Dr. Harrison said, "what you did today saved lives in ways that can't be quantified. You coordinated a mass casualty response that will be studied in medical schools for years." Samuel smiled, wringing out his mop with hands that had just helped coordinate the medical care of 47 critical patients. "I just reminded people of things they already knew, Doctor. The training they received, the knowledge they possess, it was all there. Sometimes we just need someone to help us remember." He gestured toward the trauma bay, now clean and organized and ready for whatever emergencies might come. "This is my job," he said simply, "making sure the people who save lives have what they need to do their work. Whether that's a clean floor or a bit of advice from an old soldier, it's all the same mission." Dr. Mitchell approached, still in his scrubs but looking more confident and competent than he had ever appeared before. "Samuel," Mitchell said, "I've been offered a position at Johns Hopkins, head of their new combat trauma program. It's an incredible opportunity, but I wanted to ask, would you consider coming with me? As a full partner, not as a consultant. The program needs someone with your experience." Samuel considered the offer carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Dr. Mitchell, you don't need me anymore. What you needed was to understand that medicine is about more than procedures and protocols. You've learned that now. You'll do great things at Johns Hopkins." He paused, looking around at the hospital that had become his second home. "Besides, Chicago General needs good janitors too, and I've discovered that you can change lives from anywhere, as long as you remember that service isn't about the title you hold, it's about the difference you make." Mitchell nodded, understanding that he had received a lesson more valuable than any medical degree. "Thank you, sir," he said simply, "for everything." Samuel smiled and returned to his work. The quiet janitor, who had reminded an entire medical staff that true expertise often comes in unexpected packages, and that the most important healing sometimes happens not in the operating room, but in the quiet moments when wisdom passes from one generation to the next. Years later, Dr. Mitchell would become one of the nation's leading trauma surgeons, known for his innovative techniques and his exceptional patient care. When asked about his influences, he would always mention an old combat medic who had taught him that medicine was about more than medical knowledge. It was about recognizing the humanity in every patient and the potential for learning in every encounter. And at Chicago General Hospital, Samuel Rodriguez continued his quiet work, mopping floors and cleaning equipment, serving patients in his own unique way, and occasionally sharing the hard-won wisdom of a combat medic who had learned that the most important battles are often fought not with weapons, but with compassion, skill, and the courage to serve others, regardless of recognition or reward. The story of the forgotten medic became part of the hospital's culture, a reminder that heroes don't always wear scrubs, that expertise can come from the most unexpected sources, and that true service is measured not by the position you hold, but by the lives you touch and the difference you make in the world. 5 years after that transformative day in the trauma bay, Chicago General Hospital had become something extraordinary. The partnership between Samuel Rodriguez and Dr. Mitchell had evolved into a comprehensive program that was revolutionizing how urban hospitals approached emergency medicine. The Combat Medicine Integration Program, officially named the Rodriguez-Mitchell Protocol, was now being studied and replicated at medical centers across the country. But the real impact went far beyond official recognition or academic papers. Dr. Mitchell, now the hospital's chief of emergency medicine, stood before a packed auditorium addressing a national conference of trauma surgeons. Behind him on the screen was a photograph of Samuel, taken during one of their informal training sessions, surrounded by young residents hanging on every word of his field medicine wisdom. "The most important lesson I've learned in my career," Mitchell told the assembled physicians, "came not from a textbook or a professor, but from a janitor who taught me that true medical knowledge isn't about memorizing protocols. It's about understanding that every patient is fighting for their life, and our job is to fight alongside them." In the audience, heads nodded in recognition. Many of the doctors present had their own stories of mentors who had appeared in unexpected forms, of wisdom that came from the most unlikely sources. Meanwhile, back at Chicago General, Samuel was conducting his weekly field medicine fundamentals session in the hospital's training center. What had started as informal consultations had grown into a structured program that was now mandatory for all emergency department staff. In Kandahar, Samuel was explaining to a group of young residents, "We had a saying, the patient doesn't care about your degree, they care about your hands. What we meant was that all the medical knowledge in the world is useless if you can't apply it under pressure, with limited resources, when everything is going wrong." Among the residents was Dr. Sarah Chen, a second-year emergency medicine resident who had specifically requested assignment to Chicago General after hearing about the Rodriguez protocol during her medical school rotation. "Mr. Rodriguez," Dr. Chen asked, "how do you maintain that calm focus when everything around you is chaos? Today during the multi-vehicle accident, I felt completely overwhelmed, but you seemed so centered." Samuel smiled, the question taking him back to countless similar moments in forward operating bases where young medics had asked the same thing. "The secret, Misha, is understanding that chaos is just order that you haven't recognized yet. Every emergency follows patterns, patterns of injury, patterns of treatment, patterns of human response. Once you learn to see the patterns, the chaos becomes manageable." He gestured toward the simulation mannequins they'd been using for training. "But more important than technical skills is something we called battlefield empathy, the ability to connect with your patient as a human being, even in the worst circumstances. When people are scared and in pain, sometimes the most powerful medicine you can offer is the assurance that someone competent is fighting for their life." Dr. Chen scribbled notes, but Samuel could see she was still struggling with the concept. "Let me tell you about a young soldier I treated outside Kabul," Samuel continued, his voice taking on the storytelling cadence that his students had come to love. "IED blast, multiple injuries, touch and go for hours. But what I remember most wasn't the medical procedures, it was holding his hand and telling him about my grandson's baseball game while I worked on him." Samuel paused, the memory still vivid after all these years. He survived, not just because of the medical treatment, but because he knew someone cared about him as more than just a set of injuries to be fixed. That human connection, that's often the difference between a patient who fights to live and one who gives up. The training session was interrupted by the familiar sound of trauma alerts echoing through the hospital. Samuel and the residents immediately shifted into response mode, but now it was with the coordinated efficiency that had become Chicago General's signature. As they moved toward the emergency department, Samuel noticed something that filled him with quiet pride. The residents weren't just following medical protocols, they were applying the holistic approach he'd taught them, thinking not just about procedures, but about the human beings they were about to treat. Chen took the lead on the incoming trauma case, a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding. As she began her assessment, Samuel watched her hands move with confidence, her voice calm and reassuring as she spoke to the frightened patient. "Sir, I'm Dr. Chen, and we're going to take excellent care of you," she said, establishing the human connection even as she performed her medical evaluation. "Can you tell me your name? Good. And do you have family we should call?" Samuel nodded approvingly. She was learning that medicine was as much about treating fear and anxiety as it was about treating physical injuries. The case went smoothly, with Dr. Chen demonstrating the kind of competent, compassionate care that Samuel had been teaching. But it was after the patient was stabilized and transferred to surgery that the real learning moment occurred. "Mr. Rodriguez," Dr. Chen said, approaching Samuel as he returned to his cleaning duties, "I wanted to thank you. What you taught me today about connecting with the patient, it made all the difference. I could see it in his eyes when he realized someone really cared about him. Samuel smiled, remembering his own early days learning field medicine from grizzled sergeants who had taught him that healing was about more than technical skills. You're learning, Mika, but remember, every patient teaches you something too. Stay humble, stay curious, and always remember that medicine is a privilege, the privilege of being present in someone's most vulnerable moment. As Dr. Chen walked away, Samuel reflected on the transformation he'd witnessed, not just in her, but in hundreds of medical professionals who had passed through the program over the years. The ripple effects of that first confrontation with Dr. Mitchell had spread far beyond anyone could have imagined. Later that evening, as Samuel finished his shift and prepared to head home, he received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Mitchell, still in his white coat, but looking relaxed despite the long day, approached with 2 cups of coffee from the hospital cafeteria. "Thought you might need this," Mitchell said, offering one of the cups. "Long day." Samuel accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how much Mitchell had changed from the arrogant young doctor he'd first encountered. The years of partnership had transformed them both. "James," Samuel said, using Mitchell's first name as he had for the past several years. "I've been thinking about retiring from the cleaning crew. Maybe it's time to make my consulting work more official." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. What brought this on? Samuel smiled, looking around at the emergency department where their unlikely partnership had begun. "I'm 78 now. My knees aren't what they used to be, and I think the program has grown beyond what I can handle as a part-time consultant. You need someone younger, someone who can travel to other hospitals, teach the protocols we've developed." Mitchell was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "Samuel, this program exists because of your wisdom and experience. I'm not sure anyone else could replicate what you've brought to it." Samuel shook his head gently. "The program exists because we learn to work together, to combine different kinds of knowledge for a common purpose. That's not dependent on me personally. It's a principle that can be taught and replicated." He gestured toward the trauma bay where Dr. Chen and other residents were finishing their shift, their confident competence a testament to the training they'd received. "Besides, the best teachers are the ones who make themselves unnecessary. You and the other doctors have learned what I had to teach. Now it's time for you to teach others." Mitchell nodded slowly, understanding that Samuel was right but still reluctant to lose his mentor and partner. "What will you do?" Mitchell asked. Samuel smiled, his eyes twinkling with the kind of mischief that had gotten him through decades of military service. "My grandson is starting medical school next year. Keeps asking me to tell him stories about the old days. Maybe it's time I wrote some of those stories down, made sure they don't get lost." He paused, looking thoughtful. "And there's a veterans hospital across town that could use some help with their trauma program. Seems like there might be some old combat medics there who have stories to tell too." Mitchell laughed, recognizing that Samuel Rodriguez would never truly retire from the mission of helping others. "Promise me something," Mitchell said. "When you write those stories, make sure you include the part about the arrogant young doctor who almost missed learning the most important lesson of his career." Samuel clinked his coffee cup against Mitchell's. "That story's not finished yet, James. I have a feeling the best chapters are still being written." As they walked toward the hospital exit together, 2 medical professionals from different generations and vastly different backgrounds, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them together. A confrontation born of misunderstanding had become a partnership that had touched thousands of lives. The janitor and the doctor, the combat medic and the trauma surgeon, the teacher and the student, all the same people, depending on the moment and the need. That was the real lesson of the Rodriguez-Mitchell protocol. That healing comes from recognizing the potential for learning and service in every encounter, regardless of titles or presumed hierarchies. The forgotten medic had never really been forgotten. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to remind the world that wisdom often comes in unexpected packages, and that the most important medicine is the willingness to serve others with competence, compassion, and the humility to learn something new from every patient, every colleague, and every day. Because that's what brothers in arms do for each other. They teach, they learn, they heal, and they pass on the knowledge that can save lives and transform hearts, one story at a time, one lesson at a time, one act of service at a time.